It is a grey morning in the summer of 1944, somewhere in the hedgerows of Normandy. A German infantry section is dug in behind a wall of earth and tangled roots, waiting. They are veterans. Many of them have fought in Russia, in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, and they have survived things most men never live to describe. They know war. They know the sound of every weapon that might come for them. And then the Americans open fire. At first, the German sergeant is certain he is hearing machine guns. The volume of it is overwhelming, a continuous rolling wall of rifle fire that never seems to pause for anyone to work a bolt or change a magazine. He counts the muzzle flashes, and the math does not add up. There are far fewer men across that field than the amount of fire suggests. Every single American soldier over there seems to be firing as fast as he can pull the trigger, and none of them are stopping. The sergeant had been briefed about the Americans months ago, in a tone that was almost dismissive. Amateurs. Soft, industrial soldiers who had never truly bled for anything. And yes, they carried a strange self-loading rifle, but it was heavy, over-engineered. The kind of expensive toy you would expect from a country with more money than warriors. Lying in the dirt now, pinned by a storm of fire he cannot suppress and cannot outshoot, the sergeant begins to understand that everything he was told was wrong. This is the story of a rifle that was supposed to be a mistake. A weapon so simple, so cheap, and so unglamorous that the finest military minds in Germany, men who prided themselves on precision engineering above all else, looked at it and saw a joke. It was not a joke. By the end of the war, captured German documents, prisoner interrogations, and the private accounts of Wehrmacht veterans would tell a very different story, one of grudging respect, and in more than a few cases something much closer to fear. This is the story of why the officers of the most feared army on earth came to dread a plain, mass-produced American rifle far more than they ever expected to. And to understand that fear, we first have to understand the confidence that came before it. To understand why German officers were so wrong about the American rifle, you have to understand how right they believed themselves to be about war in general. In the years between the two world wars, the German military rebuilt itself around a very particular philosophy. Firepower, in the German view, did not belong to the individual soldier. It belonged to the squad, and specifically to the machine gun at the heart of that squad. The German infantry section was designed as a support structure for its light machine gun, first the MG-34, and later the terrifying MG-42, a weapon that could spit out over 1,000 rounds a minute and made a sound so distinctive that Allied troops nicknamed it Hitler's buzzsaw. Everything revolved around that gun. The riflemen in a German squad were, in a very real sense, servants of the machine gun. They carried its ammunition, they protected its flanks, they spotted targets for it. Their own rifles, the bolt-action Karabiner 98K, were considered perfectly adequate for that supporting role. And the Kar 98K was, on its own terms, an excellent weapon, accurate, rugged, chambered for a powerful cartridge, deadly in the hands of a trained marksman at ranges most soldiers would never dare attempt. German infantry doctrine placed enormous value on the disciplined, aimed shot. One rifleman, one target, one kill. That was the ideal, but there was a hidden assumption buried inside all of this. The German system assumed that individual riflemen did not need to produce much volume of fire, because volume was the machine gun's job. It assumed that a well-trained soldier firing carefully aimed bolt-action shots, backed by a fast-firing machine gun, would always dominate a firefight. For most of the war, against most opponents, that assumption held. The Kar 98K had served in the trenches of the First World War in its earlier form. It was familiar, trusted, and cheap enough to arm millions of men. Why would anyone abandon a system that worked? So when German intelligence officers studied the American Army in the late 1930s, they were not impressed. The United States Army of that era was tiny, a fraction of the size of the European powers, poorly funded and largely forgotten by its own government. On paper, it ranked below nations most people have long since forgotten as military threats. German planners saw a country with industry, yes, but no serious army and no warrior tradition to speak of. And then they noticed that this small, unserious army had adopted something strange, a self-loading rifle, as standard issue. for every single infantryman. To the German general staff, this looked less like innovation and more like foolishness. A self-loading rifle was complex. It had more moving parts than a bolt action, which meant more things that could break, more that could jam, more that could fail in the mud and dust and cold of a real battlefield. It would be expensive. It would waste ammunition because soldiers would spray it carelessly instead of taking disciplined, aimed shots. And it would encourage exactly the kind of undisciplined, ammunition-hungry fighting that German doctrine despised. The Americans, the thinking went, had simply not learned the hard lessons that Germany had paid for in blood. They would find out. The rifle the Germans were dismissing had a long and unlikely birth, and the man behind it was not even American by origin. His name was John Garand, born Jean Cantius Garand in Quebec, Canada, in 1888. His family moved to New England when he was young, and as a boy he went to work in textile mills, surrounded by machinery, developing an instinct for how mechanical things fit together. He was a quiet, obsessive tinkerer, the kind of man who saw a problem and could not put it down until he had solved it. His true obsession was firearms design. Garand went to work at Springfield Armory, the United States government's own weapons factory, and there he set himself against one of the hardest problems in small arms, building a self-loading rifle that was reliable enough and simple enough to be trusted in the hands of an ordinary soldier under the worst conditions imaginable. This was not a small ambition. Many nations had experimented with self-loading rifles, and almost all had run into the same brutal wall. The mechanisms were delicate. They fouled with dirt, choked on ammunition, worked fine on a test range, and failed in a swamp. The dream of putting a semi-automatic rifle in the hands of every infantryman had defeated designer after designer for decades. Garand spent years on the problem. He worked through failed prototypes, dead-end mechanisms, and endless rounds of testing. He designed a gas-operated system, one that tapped a small amount of the high-pressure gas from each fired cartridge and used it to cycle the action automatically, ejecting the spent case and loading the next round without the soldier ever touching a bolt. The result was formally adopted by the United States Army in 1936, and it was designated the M1. Most people would come to know it simply by its designer's name, the Garand. It fired the same powerful .30-06 cartridge as the older American bolt-action rifles, so it hit just as hard. It loaded from an 8-round clip that dropped into the top of the rifle, and crucially, it worked. Not perfectly at first, early versions had problems that had to be fixed, but once refined, the M1 Garand proved astonishingly reliable. It kept running in mud, in sand, in snow, in jungle rot. It absorbed abuse that would have crippled more delicate designs. With this rifle, the United States became the first major military power in history to make a self-loading rifle the standard weapon of its infantry. Not a special weapon for elite units. Not a limited-issue experiment. The standard rifle, in the hands of the ordinary soldier. The Germans knew all of this, and they still weren't worried, because knowing that the Americans had built a clever rifle was one thing. The Germans were about to learn what it actually meant to face an entire army carrying it. Here is where the story turns on a single word, a word right there in the way we're framing it. Cheap. Because the German officers were not entirely wrong. A self-loading rifle was more complex than a bolt action. It should have been more expensive to produce, harder to manufacture in large numbers, and a logistical nightmare to field across an entire army. In most countries, it would have been exactly that. The Germans had assumed that even if the Garand was a good rifle, the Americans could never build enough to matter, that the complexity of the weapon would limit it to a fraction of their soldiers, while the rest made do with older bolt actions, as most of the world's armies still did. They fundamentally misunderstood what the United States was. America's true secret weapon in the Second World War was not any single piece of equipment. It was the American factory. It was an industrial machine of a scale the world had never seen. Assembly lines, interchangeable parts, mass production techniques honed in the automobile industry and now turned toward the business of war. The same country that had learned to build millions of affordable cars for ordinary families now turned that same genius toward building millions of affordable rifles for ordinary soldiers. Springfield Armory and the Winchester Company churned out M1 Garands by the millions. Over the course of the war, American industry produced more than 4 million of these rifles. By the time production finally ended years later, the total climbed past 5 million. The cost of each rifle, once mass production hit its stride, came down to a figure that would have stunned the German planners. Records put it at somewhere around $85 apiece in wartime money. For a self-loading rifle, in quantities the Germans could barely comprehend. This is the heart of what the Germans got wrong. They had built their doctrine on the idea that firepower had to be concentrated in a few expensive crew-served weapons. The machine gun at the center of the squad, precisely because you could not afford to give every man a rapid-firing weapon. The Americans had just proven that you could. Every American rifleman, not the specialists, not the elite, but every ordinary infantryman carried a weapon that could fire as fast as he could pull the trigger and reload. And the United States could afford to do it because it had solved the one problem the Germans assumed was unsolvable: making a complex weapon cheap enough and plentiful enough to hand out to an entire army. The word cheap was supposed to be an insult. It was supposed to mean flimsy, throwaway, unserious. Instead, cheap meant everywhere. Cheap meant that there was no such thing as a lightly armed American infantry unit. Cheap meant that the moment a German soldier made contact with the Americans, he was facing a wall of semi-automatic fire, and there was no weak point in the line, no under-equipped flank to exploit because they all had the same rifle. The Germans were about to discover what that felt like. The reckoning did not come all at once. It came in stages across a series of campaigns as more and more German soldiers came home carrying the same unsettling report. The early clashes in North Africa were rough for the Americans, and the Germans took away a low opinion from those first battles. Green American troops made green mistakes, and the veteran Africa Corps punished them for it. If the story had ended there, the German contempt might have been justified. But it did not end there. As the war ground on through Tunisia, Sicily, up the brutal spine of Italy, and finally onto the beaches and hedgerows of France, the German assessment of the American infantryman changed slowly, grudgingly, and then decisively. And at the center of that change was the volume of fire coming from the American lines. To understand the shock, you have to understand the arithmetic of a firefight. A German soldier with a Kar 98K, working the bolt between each shot, could manage perhaps 10 to 15 aimed rounds in a minute under combat conditions. And that was with training and a clear head, which is not what most men have when they are being shot at. Every shot required the same ritual: fire, work the bolt, aim, fire again. In the second it took to cycle that bolt, the rifle was out of the fight. An American with an M1 Garand had no such interruption. He aimed, he fired, and the rifle reloaded itself instantly. He could put out 40-50 aimed rounds a minute, 3 or 4 times the rate of the German facing him. And when his 8 rounds were spent, the empty clip ejected and he could reload in a second or two and keep going. Now multiply that across an entire squad, across an entire platoon, every man producing 3 or 4 times the fire of his German counterpart. The result was not just more bullets, it was fire superiority, the ability of the Americans to put out such a continuous volume of fire that the Germans could not lift their heads to shoot back. This is why German soldiers so often reported that they were being fired on by machine guns when they were not. The sheer density of rifle fire from an American unit sounded, to a man trained on the bolt action, like automatic weapons. They would radio back estimates of enemy strength that were wildly inflated, because they were counting guns based on the noise, and the noise was the sound of ordinary riflemen firing at a rate the Germans had reserved, in their imagination, for the machine gun alone. And here is the psychological cruelty of it. The German system was built on the machine gun as the great equalizer. But when both sides had that firepower, and one side also had it in every single rifle, the equation broke. The German machine gun was still deadly, but it was one gun. It could be located, suppressed, and once it was, the German squad's firepower collapsed. The American squad's firepower did not depend on one gun. It was distributed across every man in the line. No story about the M1 Garand is complete without addressing its most famous and most controversial feature: the sound. The M1 loaded from a metal clip that held 8 rounds. When the last round was fired, the empty clip was automatically ejected from the top of the rifle, and it made a distinctive, high metallic sound as it flew out. A ping. And out of that little sound grew one of the most enduring legends of the Second World War. The legend goes like this. German soldiers, the story says, learned to listen for the ping. In the heat of a firefight, a sharp-eared German would hear that telltale metallic ring and know in an instant that the American across from him had just fired his last round and was now holding an empty rifle. And in that fatal pause, the second or two it took the American to reload, the German would leap up and rush him or take the clear, unhurried shot at a man who could not shoot back. It is a wonderful story. It appears in books, in films, in countless retellings. And it captures something real about the reputation of the rifle. The idea that the Garand was so dominant that its one weakness had to be studied and exploited just to survive against it. But is it true? Most serious historians are deeply skeptical, and for very good reasons. Consider the reality of a battlefield. It is not quiet. It is an overwhelming chaos of rifles, machine guns, artillery, shouting, explosions. The idea that a single soldier could pick out one specific metallic ping, identify which enemy it came from, judge that this man was now empty, and act in the 2 seconds before the American reloaded, all while under fire himself, stretches belief past the breaking point. And soldiers do not fight alone. A well-trained American squad did not empty all its rifles at the same moment. While one man reloaded, his comrades kept firing, covering him. The ping of a single empty clip did not mean the line was suddenly defenseless. Charging it on the strength of one sound would have been suicide. So the ping legend is almost certainly exaggerated and probably mostly false as a battlefield tactic. But its very existence tells us something important. Legends do not attach themselves to unimportant weapons. The reason the ping myth survives is that the rifle behind it earned a reputation fearsome enough that people wanted to believe it had a secret weakness. You do not invent elaborate folklore about how to survive an ordinary gun. You invent it about the gun that terrifies you. Nowhere did the American firepower advantage matter more than in the close, murderous country of Normandy. When the Allies landed in France in June of 1944, they moved off the beaches into a landscape that seemed designed to swallow armies whole. The bocage, a centuries-old patchwork of small fields, each hemmed in by thick earthen banks, topped with dense, tangled hedgerows, their roots grown into walls of packed soil a soldier could not see through and could barely climb. For the Germans defending it, the bocage was a gift. It broke the battlefield into hundreds of tiny sealed compartments. It neutralized much of the Allied advantage in tanks and aircraft because you cannot bomb what you cannot see, and a tank in a narrow lane between 2 hedgerows is a coffin. The fighting became close, brutally, intimately close. Men fought field by field, hedge by hedge, sometimes only meters apart, unable to see the enemy until they were almost on top of him. And this was exactly the kind of fighting where the M1 Garand came into its own. At long range, the German emphasis on precision marksmanship had value, but in the bocage, engagements happened at terrifyingly short distances, often without warning, decided in seconds. In that environment, the ability to put out a sudden, overwhelming volume of aimed fire was not just an advantage, it was the difference between life and death. Imagine a German counterattack coming over a hedgerow, a handful of men rising up to rush an American position. Against bolt-action rifles, they might have a chance, might close the distance in the gaps between shots. Against a line of Garands, each one firing as fast as its user could aim, they ran into a wall. The Americans did not need to pause and cycle their bolts. They did not offer those gaps. The counterattack met continuous fire and dissolved. Again and again, small American units held or seized positions through sheer weight of individual firepower. Not artillery, not tanks, but riflemen, each effectively worth 3 or 4 German riflemen in raw rate of fire. And the German soldiers who survived carried away a respect for the American rifle that no intelligence briefing had prepared them for. The men who had once been told the Americans were amateurs with an over-engineered toy were now writing home and telling their comrades a very different truth. The Americans, they said, do not run out of bullets. You cannot pin them the way you pin other troops, because the moment you try, they answer with a volume of fire you cannot match. It was the kind of hard-won knowledge that spreads through an army by word of mouth, from veteran to replacement, faster than any official report. Perhaps the clearest proof of how seriously the firepower gap was taken lies not in what German soldiers said, but in what German designers did. Germany had entered the war supremely confident in its bolt-action doctrine. But confidence is one thing, and the evidence of the battlefield is another. As the war progressed, German troops were increasingly on the receiving end of enemy self-loading fire, not only from the Americans, but from the Soviets, whose SVT-40 gave them the same problem on the Eastern Front. Everywhere they turned, the Germans met enemies who could outshoot them round for round, and so the nation that had dismissed self-loading rifles as an American folly began urgently to build its own. The Germans developed a semi-automatic rifle of their own, the Gewehr 43, a gas-operated weapon fed from a detachable magazine, borrowing ideas from the captured Soviet rifles that had impressed them. But they were years behind, and their industry, bombed, stretched, starved of resources, could never produce it in anything close to the numbers America was pumping out Garands. The Gewehr 43 was made in the hundreds of thousands. The Garand was made in the millions. It was too little and far too late. But the German response did not stop at simply copying the concept of the self-loading rifle. Their designers pushed further, and in doing so they arrived at something genuinely revolutionary, a weapon that would shape the rest of the century of warfare. They reasoned that if volume of fire was now the deciding factor, then why stop at semi-automatic? Why not give the individual soldier a weapon that could fire fully automatic when needed, but chambered for a smaller intermediate cartridge that a man could actually control and carry in quantity? The result was the Sturmgewehr, the storm rifle, or assault rifle, a weapon that combined the range of a rifle with the rapid fire of a submachine gun. It was the ancestor of nearly every modern infantry rifle that followed. Think about the irony. The Germans, so proud of their bolt-action marksmanship doctrine, were driven in part by the firepower they faced from enemies like the Americans to invent the future of the infantry rifle. The very concept they had mocked, that the individual soldier should be a source of high-volume fire, they ended up embracing and pushing to its logical conclusion. But they arrived too late and in numbers too small to change the outcome of the war. The Americans had bet, years earlier, that the future belonged to firepower in every soldier's hands. The Germans spent the war being convinced they were right. Now we come to the heart of it. Because there is a difference between a soldier fearing a weapon and an officer fearing it. And the officers, in the end, had the most reason of all to be afraid. A frontline soldier fears the rifle that might kill him personally. That fear is immediate and physical. But an officer's fear is different, and in some ways deeper, because an officer's job is to make war work, to plan, to maneuver, to win through the correct application of doctrine. And the American rifle attacked something an officer holds even more dear than his own life. It attacked his assumptions. Every plan a German officer made rested on a set of beliefs about what his men could do and what the enemy could do. He believed that his squad, built around its machine gun, could win a firefight against an enemy squad of riflemen. He believed that if he could locate and suppress the enemy's machine gun, the enemy's firepower would collapse. He believed that trained marksmanship and disciplined maneuver would carry the day against undisciplined mass. These were not just tactics, they were the foundation of everything the German army believed about itself. The Garand quietly dismantled all of it. Against an army where every rifleman produced machine gun-like volume, there was no single weak point to suppress. Knock out the American machine gun and the squad kept pouring out fire, because its firepower never depended on that one gun. Try to win the marksmanship duel and you lost, because the American answered every aimed shot with 3 or 4 of his own. Try to maneuver, to rush a position, and you ran into a wall of continuous fire with no gaps to advance through. And the cheapness made this worse, not better. If the Garand had been a rare, elite weapon, the officer could have planned around it, probe for the units that didn't have it, exploit the weakly armed formations. But there were no weakly armed American formations. Because the rifle was cheap enough to give to everyone, he faced this problem everywhere, all the time, with no soft spots and no clever tactical solution. This is what turned professional respect into something colder. A German officer could respect a fine sniper rifle or a powerful tank. But the Garand did not just kill his men, it made his entire way of fighting obsolete. In the hands of soldiers, he had been taught to dismiss as amateurs. It took the thing German officers were proudest of, their doctrine, their belief in quality over quantity, and beat it not with superior engineering, but with the one factor they could never match: numbers. Endless, affordable, industrial numbers, each set of hands holding a rifle that never seemed to stop firing. That is a genuinely frightening thing to face as a commander. Not a weapon you can outfight, but a weapon that tells you the entire framework you built your career on was wrong. When the war finally ended, the verdict on the rifle came from an unlikely source, one of America's most aggressive generals, a man not known for handing out praise. General George S. Patton, who drove his armies across Europe and had little patience for anything that did not help him win, put his opinion of the M1 Garand in writing. In his judgment, it was the greatest battle implement ever devised. Coming from Patton, that was not sentiment. It was a professional assessment from a man who had watched his soldiers fight and win with it across 2 continents. But the deeper legacy of the Garand is not really about the rifle itself, remarkable as it was. It is about the idea behind it, and the way that idea humbled one of the most sophisticated military machines in history. The Germans built their army on the belief that quality would always beat quantity, that superior training, superior doctrine, and superior engineering concentrated in a few elite weapons would overcome any enemy who relied on mere numbers. It was a proud philosophy, and for a long time it worked. But the M1 Garand represented a different idea entirely. It said that the decisive weapon of modern war might not be the most sophisticated one at all. It might be the one you could build by the millions, cheaply enough to put into the hands of every ordinary man, so that there was no weak link anywhere in the line. The Germans looked at that rifle and saw cheapness, and they mistook cheapness for weakness. It was the most expensive misunderstanding of their war. Cheap did not mean flimsy. Cheap meant everywhere, every farm boy and factory worker America put into uniform carrying a weapon that outshot the finest bolt-action rifle the German army could field, with no elite tactic or proud doctrine that could solve a problem present in every single enemy soldier on the field. The officers who had been briefed to expect an amateur army with an over-engineered toy learned the truth in the hedgerows of Normandy and the mountains of Italy and the forests of Germany itself. They learned it one firefight at a time, one inflated estimate of enemy machine guns at a time, one failed counterattack at a time. And by the end, the fear was real. Not the fear of a single deadly weapon, but the far worse fear of realizing that the enemy you underestimated had understood the future of war better than you did. They feared a cheap American rifle more than they ever expected to. And in the end, the reason was simple. It was not that the rifle was better than everything they had. It was that it was good enough, and there were millions of it, and it never ever stopped firing. That was a lesson the German officer corps did not survive to unlearn, and it is why, of all the weapons that beat them, the one that unsettled them most was the one they had laughed at first.